What we're doing in Ukraine is just so unbelievably cruel. If you think just, I heard that about 2,000 Ukrainians or more are dying every day on the front, and they're fighting a war that they don't want to fight. Like you said, they're having to pull people off the streets. I see these videos too. Like I saw a video of a new father with his wife, an infant son, and they rip him away from him and his wife and his kid, and they throw him in a van. It's just, and he's just going to most likely die within a couple of weeks. They only get a couple of weeks training, and they send him to the front line. Yeah, it's just so crazy that this is what we're supporting. Has there ever been something similar like this before, where we see, where a proxy is forced to sacrifice its whole country for a war that clearly they can't win,
Yeah.
and it's
Oh,
just
it's
it's
right. It's
so unbelievably cruel.
right. Right.
It's
Yeah. Well, it's just right. I mean, it is. No, I can't think of anything. I'm sure there are historical precedents, but I just, in the last several decades, I can't think of anything like this. It's just right. It's not just the stories, not just the videos that you see all the time of these poor people being just pulled off the streets, but then there's just the fact that they're swimming across the rivers, hiring people to take them up through the mountains. People, they're handing over their life fortunes or family fortunes just to escape. Um, I was thinking the other day, I guess, like during the Cold War, um, um, it was John F. Kennedy made a very famous speech in Berlin, when he said that, well, we don't have to build a wall to keep our people in. And he's made a very valid point, right? I mean, that was true. I mean, it wasn't that the Westerners were trying to escape into East Germany. It was the other way around. And I think that is very telling. People will say all kinds of things in opinion polls, but what really tells you what people believe, what matters to them, is like where they go, where their feet take them. And in Ukraine, people are not trying to get into Ukraine; they're trying to get out of it. It's just, and we're part of this effort to keep them in, actually, and more than that, to force them, simply, basically to shackle them and send them to the front lines. This is, it's a horrible, really, it just, I don't think the horror of it really can be exaggerated, but there's just a complete lack of concern, and just almost no reporting on it whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, we're even trying to get Ukrainians that have fled the country to go back,
Right.
don't reissue them passports. I even saw, even the Israeli government made an announcement saying, if you're dual citizens of Ukraine and Israel, don't go to Ukraine, because Ukraine will not let dual citizens leave the country. If you're a man, they will keep you there, and they will send you to the front line because they're scraping the bottom of the barrel, and you
Uh-huh.
will most likely die.
Right.
And something where you're not even fighting the Russians at this point. You just get shipped off to the front line, and then a 3,000-pound glide bomb lands on you and wipes out your whole platoon. That's what happens. It doesn't even seem like they're even fighting the Russians that much. They do know the Russian casualty numbers. I mean, there's some that get killed by FPV drones and stuff like
Right.
this, but I'm hearing it seems like the Russians aren't really experiencing hardly any
Right.
casualties anymore,
Right. I
and
think
the
it's
Ukrainians are
right.
skyrocketing.
Right. Yeah, what we have, like the Russians don't report their own casualty figures. They did that a little bit at the beginning of the war, and then they stopped it. But the best source, I think the most reliable source for Russian casualty figures is by this Media Zona project, which is actually it's a collaborative project jointly run by the BBC and Media Zona, which is an opposition group, an anti-Putin group in Russia. So, I mean, these are two very, obviously not friends of the Russian government, right? They have every incentive really to exaggerate the casualty figures, and through their research, which consists of actually going through obituaries, visiting cemeteries, reading local papers, and so on and so forth. Trying to scrounge up or find, locate every last death that was linked to the SMO possible. They've managed to find, last I heard, and maybe a little bit higher now, that they had found a total of 55,000 Russian fatalities.
Is that for the whole war?
For the whole war, right. And that's significant. It's approximately equal to, what the Americans suffered in all of Vietnam. But the important thing, that's important, but another important aspect of, of their findings is the general trend. And the trend has been downward for the last several months. There were two peaks. One, I think, during the first month in the initial phase of the SMO, and the second during Bakhmut. And last year there was a small peak at the beginning of the Avdiivka campaign, but since then it's been dropping steadily. And I think for the last several months, in fact, the Russians have been experiencing suffering fewer casualties than any other time during the war.
Do you have any idea what that would mean on a per average day basis over the past month or so? Or
I don't know, but it could vary. It's probably, I would say it's double digits or something, like
really under 100.
Yeah,
as opposed to 2,000 plus for the Ukrainians.
For the 2,000 figure we get from actually the Russian Ministry of Defense, and they've been, reporting their estimates of Ukrainian casualties. Now it's not just killed; it's killed and seriously wounded. Killed basically, people that have been put out of action. So I don't know exactly what the proportion is, how many of those are killed, how many of those are wounded. But what you can see from there is people can argue about the accuracy. I tend to believe them. It's just that the Russian Ministry of Defense is actually very conservative and careful about what it says. I'll just give you an example. I think it was just yesterday, or it may have in fact been today, that they announced that the village of, I think it's Alexandrovka, or something like that. I'm not great with these names, but just north of Ocheretino, had been captured by the Russians. Now, that is 2 weeks after the British Ministry of Defense announced the same thing. They actually said, oh yeah, this village is fallen. But the Russian Ministry of Defense held off until finally today, because they're very, very conservative. So, they're not out there trying to get the positive news out. They just want to be absolutely sure about what they say. They were waiting, I think, for some territory to the south of it to be captured, and then they could say, okay, it's just completely secure. There's no chance that the Ukrainians can ever take this back. Now we'll announce it. That's their general approach. Very cautious, very conservative. So I tend to believe their figures. And now and then in any case, you can see what the relative casualty numbers. You're going to get an idea of what which battles, which areas are resulting in more casualties, and which places casualties are fewer, and over time too, you can see trends. And what you see, there's a very obvious upward trend. If you went about a year ago, maybe a typical day was under 1,000 total. I remember back, it may have been not much more than a year ago, where it would be maybe 500 total in a day. Now we're getting, like you say, up around 2,000. And there's been a definite upward trend, and it seems to be accelerating, over these last few weeks. It was just maybe a couple months ago, we're down around 1,200, now we're up at 2,000. And, it's a sign that things are really starting to break down on the front for the Ukrainians. I think it's a reflection of the chaos there, the people that are being thrown into the trenches without any training.
Well, so this 55,000 number you got, how could people look that up themselves? Because I always see people saying that there are 500,000 Russians have been killed, and you get so much anti-Russian propaganda on Twitter. So it's hard to know, when you say a number like 55,000, how do you back that up, or can we look that up?
Yeah, well, it is. It's been published, I guess at various times through the BBC, and I'm sure Mediazona has its own website. I haven't, bothered to go directly to it. I should. I'll make a point of doing it after this.
So yeah,
After
Google
the
Media
podcast.
Zona.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll let you look it up and make sure.
Okay.
But I think it's important for those to try to give the sources for that, because people throw numbers out constantly, and but then it's obviously, I think that's I have this
Yeah.
a similar worldview and position that you do on this.
Right.
But it's
Well, then
just
it's just kind of anecdotal. Again, your sister's there in Moscow, knows a lot of different people, a lot of Russians, and nobody knows anybody that
has
that
died.
knows anybody that died on the front. It's something that's not affecting daily life there. I'm sure there are probably certain villages or towns where there are more people, that a higher proportion of young men that have volunteered, and you're going to, those places are going to be more affected. There's no question about it. Moscow is a pretty liberal city. By Russian standards, it's very liberal, and there's not as much support for the war. Or there's a lot of support for the war, but people aren't as willing to go out and fight. So
Always the country boys in every country that want to go.
Right. But I remember it was a year ago. There was a survey was done of the Ukrainian population, and they found out what the majority of Ukrainians knew at least 3 people who had died, and that was a year ago. I mean, it's obviously affecting. Well, you can see it with these videos. Why are these people so terrified? They know what's happening, right? Their president can lie as much as they want, and their news agencies can lie as much as they want, and Westerners who want to believe it will believe what they say, but the Ukrainians themselves know.
But this can't go on for much longer, right? I mean, if you have to round up people on the streets like this, if they're not inflicting any real casualties on the Russians, if they're losing 2,000 men a day, everyone's fleeing. Like Ukraine is collapsing in real time now. It seems like, right? And you're starting to see some signs. Whether it be Zelensky's talking about we need to do another peace summit, we need to negotiate soon. He's making moves. So do you think that will happen? But obviously, when we're negotiating, the negotiation's not going to be between so much Ukraine and Russia. It's more between the United States and Russia. And like we said at the beginning, who does Putin talk to?
Right.
There's nobody to talk to. Anthony Blinken, I don't think, has talked to Sergei Lavrov, his counterpart, once in the past 2 years. Putin, Biden clearly is not talking to Putin, and he won't talk to him, and he's not really even capable of talking to him. So,
right. Again, it's right. I was making that point, back in December 2021, Biden agreed to it, and then Blinken just walked it back. It's just sort of like.
So does this mean that Ukraine will just keep on fighting until maybe Zelensky gets assassinated and the whole remaining population turns on the Ukrainian establishment, and or they just have to keep on going until they're all dead and until the election is over?
Yeah, right. I don't know. Yeah, it just seems like I don't know what's going to happen, but you're right. It seems like things can't continue as they are for much longer. Recently, there was some story about a coup attempt in Kiev. That there was some sort of uprising was planned, and the Ukrainian SBU, claimed to have captured the plotters. And then there's talks about, Syrskyi, who recently replaced Zaluzhny as the commander of the armed forces, that he may be fired. There was another general that recently was fired. There's this, obviously, this government is not very stable. I don't know, it just might go on like this for who knows how long. But at some point, either we'll just pull the plug, or Ukraine will implode.
I'm just thinking in the future when the history books are written and they look back on the Ukraine project and what happened in Ukraine, it's just I don't think there's any other word for it but evil, what we've done to Ukraine, what the U.S. and NATO has done to this country. And it's, and it's just so crazy that even saying what we're saying right now somehow says like, oh, you're carrying water for Putin, you want Russia to take over the whole world, we have to make sure Ukraine's victorious. Nobody steps back and talks about what does victory look like to you? If everybody's dead, is that victory? Are you happy? Because that's what we're almost at right now. Ukraine is a destroyed, hollowed out country. At this point, do you know how much of the population it's lost? You know, in terms of people that have fled and in deaths,
Right.
and it's got to be getting close to half the country is gone.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. Certainly, many millions have fled. Who knows? Maybe 500,000 deaths. It's hard to know at this point.
well, are you able to say anything about Zelensky and his push for wanting to settle this conflict? You know, he has been, talking about that a bit now. So
Yeah,
what
there's
does that
been
mean?
an obvious change in tone. You're right. I mean, first of all, I think it was about a week ago that he made some statement about how this really can't go on much longer, and Ukraine is suffering.
Right, he said a lot of our men are dying now. He was openly admitting like everybody's
right.
dying.
That's something that he just never said before. I mean, that is a real change of tone. So I'm sure it does indicate something. And then there's talk about expressed an openness to negotiations. He said, well, we can't talk to him directly, of course, because he himself had a law passed preventing any Ukrainian from negotiating with the Russians. He said, if we find the right intermediary.
Who would that intermediary be? Could it be China? It can't. Obviously, it can't be the United States.
Right.
It can't be any Western NATO country.
Right. I don't know. Turkey has played that role in the past, but they blew it in the case of those negotiations over the Azovstal steel plant. If you remember, there were some of those officers, the far right extremists that were taken prisoner by the Russians. And part of the deal was actually they were sent off to Turkey, but they're supposed to be held there until the end of the war. And then Turkey just handed them over. So I think they kind of, how can the Russians trust them they were supposed to keep their part of their bargain. That was, the intermediary is supposed to be trusted by both sides.
When he said Turkey just handed them over, you mean they handed them over to Ukraine?
To Ukraine, yeah. Right. Just to garner favor with Ukraine in the West. So I don't think it can be Turkey. I don't know.
Okay, well, maybe this question: do you see actual diplomacy happening in the near future, or do you think that it's not possible because of the situation in Biden in the West?
Right. Well, there's a real problem. First of all, there's a problem that who's in charge in the U.S. and the Russians, I think, have made it clear they feel like they do have to negotiate with the U.S. because they understand that the U.S. without the U.S. Negotiations don't really mean a whole lot because in the end it's the U.S. that is calling the shots, in Europe as a whole and in Ukraine in particular. But who are you going to talk to? We have a president that's really not there. So if there's no president, what do you do, right? And then you have this problem of trust in general. There's the Minsk Accords that were reached, back in 2015. It later had different leaders involved in the negotiations and who were signatories to the Minsk Accords. Hollande of France and Merkel of Germany, Poroshenko in Ukraine, all saying that it was just a ruse. They were just pulling the wool over the Russians' eyes as a way of it was the delaying tactics so they could build up forces in Ukraine. They were never serious about it. Well, the Russians hear this and say, well, we'd be idiots to go, to negotiate with you again, especially after what happened with the negotiations, the Istanbul negotiations in March and April of 2022. They thought that they were at least on the verge of an agreement there. And so they agreed to a ceasefire, they pulled the forces away from Kiev. And then the Ukrainians, really at the urging of the UK and the US, just tore up the agreement. So, and with those experiences, they have every reason to be very suspicious and to be very reluctant to believe in any sort of negotiations. It's just like we tried the negotiating route and both times we were burned. And, Putin himself has said that he made a mistake to trust the West. he was a fool. And a lot of people at the time actually, within Russia were saying you shouldn't trust him. It's kind of like, I think it's analogous to like what happened in Iran. You had the reformers in Iran, go pushing for these negotiations with the U.S. and the West, over their nuclear power program. And the hardliners said, you can't trust him, right? But eventually an agreement was reached. And it looked like, part of the agreement was that the West, the U.S. in particular, would start removing its sanctions from Iran. Well, the Iranians kept their part of the agreement, but the West didn't keep their part of it, and then eventually tore up the whole agreement. And so again, like, where did that put the reformers in Iran? It's like in both cases, the hardliners were proved right, right?
Yeah, trust the West.
Yeah,
That's
I
what
mean,
we
really.
become.
So exactly. So what do you do? Say, I think at this point they really, I think the chance for a negotiated settlement is very slim. I mean, first of all, you just don't see any real awareness, on the West. Sometimes you hear murmurings about some sort of negotiation, but it's so far from what the realities on the ground, and what the Russians are saying they need, that I don't see them as very significant. Zelensky is starting to murmur something, but he's still saying that, he hasn't actually admitted that he would soften any of his requirements. So I first of all, there really isn't much to see on the Western and Ukrainian side. And then the Russians just have every reason to be extremely cynical about any sort of olive branch that might be offered them. So I think that they probably came to the conclusion that we just have to do this ourselves. In other words, we're going to have to just create our own buffer zone. We're just going to have to go some certain distance west until we feel safe, and then just stop there. That's what's going to happen.
So how does this end? Do you think that it will just create a buffer zone? They move forward and they say the Dnieper and 100 kilometers past or something like what is
right. Well, I think
will Ukraine continue to be this cold kind of Cold War type of thing that like maybe there's a ceasefire, but they're building up forces and you got North Korea, South Korea style.
I know some in Russia and Mark Sloboda says that he thought that it would never come to this, or at the beginning of the war he thought, well, they're definitely never going to go into West Ukraine. Nobody wants to go into West Ukraine because unlike in East Ukraine, the Ukrainians in West Ukraine actually do hate the Russians. That's part of what they're all about. That's a big part of their identity is just hating Russians. And so you just don't want to be ruling over these people. It's going to be a mess, right? It's not going to be ugly. But he thinks that the Russians might not have a choice because they can't just have this anti-Russian state that's constantly being armed by the West right there on the border. And they just may be forced to go all the way to the Polish border. So he may be right. But then again, maybe the Russians will decide, well, it's just better to live with that. It'll be greatly weakened if we take all of East Ukraine and South Ukraine in particular, Odessa, and they don't have access to the Black Sea. And that makes it, right now they're making things difficult for the Russian Navy because they do have access to the Black Sea. But if they're denied that, first of all, it's going to be a real blow to the Ukrainian economy. And then second, it'll also make them, it'll reduce the threat, reduce the harm that they can do to Russia if they have control over the southern part of Ukraine.
Okay, so how do you think this ends? And will it end soon? Like we said before, we can't go much longer.
It's very hard to predict. We've said that we see signs of of just like the growing, let's say, crisis along the front lines. Both the increasing casualty levels, and then the accelerating. You have to say slowly accelerating, but I think still you have to say accelerating advance of the Russian forces. They're like recently they've broken through in some places on the line that were static for over 10 years, like Torsk in New York. There's actually a little town called New
Yeah.
York, right?
I saw a headline, some like Russia bombed New York. And I was like,
Yeah.
what? I was like, I knew there was a retaliation,
I knew that,
but I wasn't.
yeah. Right, right. But that's actually quite significant. That's a place where, okay, it was just static. It was one of the most highly fortified, or one area with the strongest fortifications, along the entire front. The kind of like Avdiivka, where the Ukrainians had built up these fortifications over the course of more than 10 years, and there was just hadn't been any movement there. And but apparently, because of the crisis, like up in Kharkov, they stripped the frontline units there of a lot of forces, and the Russians saw, what had happened, and they struck, and they have actually, made quite a bit of progress. It's been very rapid, and they're entering the city and surrounding New York, entering Torsk and surrounding New York. They did another one of these infiltration via pipeline attacks. If you remember in Avdiivka, they found a pipe. They spent, I think, months clearing it out. It was like full of junk. And then they sent special forces through there, the special operations forces. And it went, maybe it was a mile up the pipeline, then came up out through a hatch and took the Ukrainians by surprise in their rear there. And that was a big part of the fall of Avdiivka. Well, they did the same thing. They actually traveled 2 miles through this pipe and then popped up in the rear of the Ukrainians and immediately seized a big chunk of territory.
Wow.
So, but anyways, that's just an example of how, it's, you can't say the whole line is crumbling. There are places where the Ukrainians are really dug in and they're fighting hard. They're suffering terrible casualties, but they're at least slowing the Russian advance. So the Russians are maybe just advancing 100 meters a day or something, but they're still advancing. But in the meantime, because they've concentrated on holding these places like Chasiv Yar or Volchansk, they've been forced to strip forces in other areas, and the Russians are finding these places and pushing through suddenly, making sudden advances, and then all at the cost of very high Ukrainian casualties. So, we just see sort of this, it's not, maybe it's sort of like a collapse in slow motion. But it may speed up suddenly at some point. That's, the way these things works. They go slowly until they go very fast. And it's very hard to predict that day, when you reach that tipping point. It could be 2 weeks from now. It could be a month from now. We've forecast some sort of major Russian offensive. I think that the Russians have made signals that they're going to do this. And it may be when that offensive comes, they're maybe going to time it where they feel like they're point where the Ukrainians are about to collapse, and then they're going to push real hard, and we may see the collapse then. That could be a couple of weeks from now. It could be a month.
Morale, right?
Yeah, it could. I think I would just say that who knows, but I think, like by the end of the summer, definitely we'll see it. Okay. I think we will.
Okay. Well, Dad, I think we can probably end it here, unless there's any updates you want to give for Israel and Lebanon, Gaza, Palestine.
Well, there's certainly a lot of things to be said about that, but nothing in particular. It still seems like the Israelis are preparing to launch an attack on Hezbollah. You see videos of armored vehicles heading north. They seem to be quite serious about it. It looks like it will happen. It could be any day now.
There's so many things happening. The hard part is being able to focus on which one, that are kind of chipping away at the American empire.
Yeah.
I also want to talk about the U.S. economy and public debt and how much longer this can go on. But we'll save all that for another time. I think we can stop it there then. Okay. Thanks a lot, Dad.